The wind howled over the ridge like a wounded animal, clawing at the boards of Cyrus Blake's weather-beaten cabin as snow lashed the windows in slanted sheets. The old pine trees groaned under the weight of ice, their limbs bowing low to the frozen earth. Inside, the hearth burned low, casting flickers of gold across empty chairs and a supper gone cold. Cyrus sat alone at the kitchen table, his hat still on, his boots damp from the day's failed attempt at clearing the upper pasture. He hadn't spoken a word since dawn, not even to himself. Not since Evelyn passed. Not since the doctor shook his head and said there wasn't enough blood left to save the child, either. The storm had moved in hard and fast, like most things in Montana did. By nightfall, the land was buried under a thick, merciless sheet. The livestock huddled in the barn, breath rising in ghostly plumes. Cyrus had just banked the fire and was lighting a final lantern when something thudded against the side of the barn. Not a knock. Not an animal either, something softer. He grabbed his rifle and stepped into the dark. The cold hit him like a slap, the kind that wakes a man out of a whiskey stupor. Snow bit into his eyes, and the lantern's flame struggled against the wind. He made his way toward the barn, rifle steady, boots crunching over drifts already knee-high. The wind screamed. Another sound carried through it, barely audible. A whimper? He lifted the lantern higher, squinting into the whiteout. Then he saw it. A shape, small and crumpled, half buried in snow against the barn wall. Bare feet, ragged shirt, long black hair clinging to the face like wet moss. A child. Cyrus dropped to his knees, nearly spilling the lantern. The boy wasn't dead. Not yet. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. One arm was twisted under him, his lips blue, eyes fluttering. No blood, no visible wounds, just frozen nearly through. Without thinking, Cyrus wrapped him in his coat, hoisted him upright as a sack of kindling and carried him inside. The warmth of the cabin fought back the frost, slowly. He laid the boy near the hearth, wrapped him in every blanket he could find, rubbed his hands until color bled back into them. The boy didn't speak. Just stared, eyes sharp and still. No fear, but no trust either, like an animal used to traps. He drank the broth Cyrus set in front of him but didn't touch the bread. Didn't ask a single question. Only watched, listened, like he was measuring the man who'd pulled him from death's door. Cyrus didn't ask questions either. He just nodded once and tossed another log on the fire. "You're safe here," he said. The boy blinked slowly, didn't reply. When Cyrus woke the next morning, the blankets were folded neatly on the hearth. The boy was gone. For a split second, panic gripped him. He shoved on his boots, grabbed his coat, and pushed open the cabin door. The wind had stilled, but the snow was deep. He scanned the yard, heart thudding, then stopped. There, near the east fence, the boy stood, sleeves rolled, hands red with cold, hammering in a loose post. Quiet, focused, like he'd always belonged. Cyrus watched him for a long moment, breath rising in the morning chill. Then he nodded, just once, and turned back toward the house. He didn't know the boy's name, didn't know his story. But he knew this much. He wasn't alone anymore. The snow began to melt a week later, slow and stubborn, revealing patches of brown grass and the brittle bones of last season's harvest. The boy stayed, said nothing, ate when food was placed in front of him, slept on a pile of quilts near the hearth. In those early days, he moved like smoke, quiet, alert, always watching the door. He kept to the edges of the cabin, never quite trusting the space, never quite settling into it. But he didn't run. Cyrus didn't press him. He wasn't a man who needed many words, and he'd long since stopped expecting answers from the world. The boy's silence didn't bother him, not exactly. But there was something in it that curled around the edges of his loneliness, tightened the knot behind his ribs every time those sharp eyes met his across the supper table. On the 8th day, as they stood in the barn brushing down the horses, Cyrus broke the stillness without thinking. "Got a name, boy?" The child paused, hand still on the mare's flank. Then, in a voice low and dry as wind through sagebrush, he answered, "Tawa." Cyrus looked up from the saddle he was oiling. The boy met his gaze steady, calm. No hesitation. "Tawa," Cyrus repeated. "What's it mean?" "Son," the boy said, then turned back to brushing the horse. Cyrus considered that. The name didn't quite fit, not to his mind. There was no warmth in the boy, no golden light. What he saw instead was the cold gleam of steel, the silence of a cliff edge before a fall. Those eyes black, unblinking, belonged to a hawk circling high above a broken trail. "Hawk," Cyrus said, mostly to himself. "That's what I'll call you." Tawa Hawk glanced sideways but didn't argue. They fell into a rhythm after that. No grand talk of pasts or futures, just days built on the weight of work and the silence of understanding. Cyrus taught the boy how to boil coffee so it didn't taste like horse piss, how to split wood without splintering it, how to salt meat and mend tack and keep a fire alive through the night. He found he didn't need to say much. Hawk watched everything with hawk eyes, memorizing motion and method with the precision of someone who had learned survival was in the details. But Hawk taught things too. He showed Cyrus how to walk without snapping twigs, how to read tracks in snow or mud, the difference between a hungry coyote and a passing mule deer. One morning, before dawn, Hawk stood in the doorway and said, "Storm's coming." The sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. By sundown, the wind came howling down from the mountains, driving snow sideways against the window panes. Cyrus didn't ask how he knew. Sometimes they sat by the fire, not speaking. Hawk would carve small animals out of pine scraps. Cyrus would clean his rifle or fix a worn bridle. In the glow of the fire, they looked less like a rancher and a stray, and more like two men caught between pasts, too painful to name, and a future too uncertain to speak aloud. Neither of them called it family. But slowly, in the quiet creak of floorboards and the hush of cold mornings, something like it began to form. The sun hadn't been up more than an hour when the sound of hooves broke across the frost-hardened valley. Cyrus was chopping kindling near the porch, his breath curling in the cold like smoke. He paused mid-swing, axe balanced on his shoulder, and watched the figures ride up over the ridge. 3 of them, local men he recognized but never cared much for. Will Harrow, a butcher with a sharp mouth and a dull conscience. Caleb Finch, who ran the livery in town, and always had a flask in one pocket and a knife in the other. And behind them, silent as a ghost, came Jesse Crow, deputy, part-time preacher's son, full-time coward. They reined up a few yards from the porch, their horses snorting steam into the morning air. Will spat into the dirt and adjusted the shotgun slung behind his saddle. "Morning, Blake," he said, too casual. Cyrus let the axe rest against the chopping block. "Something I can help you boys with?" Caleb leaned on his saddle horn. "Heard tell you've got a guest." Cyrus didn't answer, just waited, his face carved from stone. "A boy," Will continued. "Little Injun fella, brown hair, doesn't talk much. Word is you found him in the snow and brought him in." "Word travels fast," Cyrus said. Jesse looked uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle. Caleb smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "We just thought we'd ride out, check on things. Can't be too careful these days. You know how folks get when there's rumors of stolen horses, missing traps, livestock gone off. Might not be your boy, but might be. Some folks don't take kindly to surprises." Will reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something wrapped in burlap. He tossed it down into the dirt with a lazy flick of the wrist. It landed with a dull thud. A chicken, dead, throat slit, its blood dried to black on white feathers. Cyrus didn't move, didn't blink. "You're a good man, Blake," Will said, voice like tar. "But good men don't always make smart decisions." The 3 turned and rode off, slow, like they weren't in any hurry, like they wanted him to watch them go. That night, the wind carried the smell of snow and something elsmoke, maybe, too faint to name. Cyrus stood by the fire, polishing the Winchester, while Hawk sat cross-legged near the window, watching the stars through a crack in the curtain. He hadn't spoken much since the men came. Barely touched his stew. Later, after Cyrus banked the fire and climbed into bed, he woke to the sound of boots on the roof. Not heavy, not urgent soft, measured. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, only to find Hawk standing there in the moonlight, scanning the tree line. "You planning to sleep up there?" Cyrus called up. Hawk didn't look away from the horizon. "Not sleeping." Cyrus sighed, rubbing the chill from his hands. "Take a rifle at least." The boy shook his head. "If they come," he said calmly, "they won't come alone." Something about the way he said it quiet, absolute made Cyrus's blood run colder than the wind ever could. The fire crackled low, casting long, flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the snow had returned, not heavy, just a quiet curtain drifting down from the black sky, whispering against the windows like ash settling on old bones. Cyrus sat in his usual chair by the hearth, nursing a tin cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Hawk sat cross-legged on the floor, whittling a thin strip of pine into something that might one day resemble a bird. His eyes, as always, were steady, far away. But tonight, something was different. Cyrus had seen it in the boy's shoulders earlier, in the way he'd flinched when thunder rolled low from the mountains. A storm was coming, not just from the sky. They'd worked the land in silence that day, patching a fence near the north field. At one point, Hawk had paused mid-swing with the hammer, staring at the ridgeline with a look Cyrus couldn't read, part sorrow, part rage, part something older than both. Now, by the firelight, Cyrus waited. Not pressing, not probing, just waiting. Hawk stopped carving. He set the pine scrap down and looked at the flames. "It wasn't soldiers," he said, voice low, flat. Cyrus glanced over, not sure what he was hearing at first. "My village. They said it was soldiers, but it wasn't." He didn't look at Cyrus, just spoke to the fire like it was the only thing that could understand. "Men came from the east. Not army, not bluecoats, bounty men. They were hunting us. Ghost scalps, they called it. Said the government paid for Cheyenne hair, more if it came from a child." Cyrus felt something twist deep in his gut. His hands clenched around the coffee cup until the metal groaned. "They came at night, lit the lodges, shot the men first. My father's fought, killed 2 before they shot him in the back. My mother, she screamed once. Then, nothing." Hawk's voice didn't shake. He told it like a man reciting the steps to a chore he'd done too many times. "I ran, into the trees, hid in a hollow log for 2 days. After that, I climbed." He finally looked at Cyrus, and there was something in his eyes that didn't belong in a boy of 9. Something ancient, shattered and sharp. "Up high, the snow keeps them away. They don't chase what they can't see. I ate pine bark, squirrel, dry roots. Sometimes I stole cornmeal from cabins when they were empty." "You survived," Cyrus said, barely above a whisper. "I waited to die," Hawk corrected. "The storm just made me walk. I didn't want to anymore, but I walked." Cyrus sat very still. The boy's words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. He'd lost Evelyn and the baby 5 years ago. Infection took them both in a single night. He'd buried them under a cottonwood tree near the creek and hadn't prayed since. Whatever was left of his faith had frozen over with the soil that winter. But looking at the boy across the fire, he felt something stir. Not pity, not sadness. Recognition. This boy hadn't been sent here to be saved. No, Cyrus realized. Maybe he'd been sent to save. The snow that morning was thick and wet, the kind that sticks to boots and mutes the sound of everything. Cyrus stood near the barn, checking the feed troughs, breath clouding in front of him when the riders crested the ridge. 3 of them. Not townsfolk. These men rode with a certain looseness in the saddle, the kind that came from miles of lawless trail. Their horses were rangy, hard-muscled, with brands Cyrus didn't recognize. One of the riders wore a buffalo hide duster, the sleeves stained dark. Another had a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, the brim curled like a sneer. The third, tall and thin with a scar slicing across his jaw, grinned like a man who'd already decided you were guilty. Cyrus didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the barn wall. Not yet. He waited. The men reined in just beyond the fence. Snow clung to their coats and horses, but none of them looked cold. They looked eager, like wolves testing the edge of a campfire. "Morning," the tall one said. "Name's Cutter. My friends here are Boone and Jax. We're just passing through." Cyrus didn't speak. Cutter grinned wider. "Word is, you're harboring a stray. Little Cheyenne boy, about yay tall." He held his hand just below his chest. "Saw tracks coming this way. Thought we might stop by, pay our respects." Boone laughed, a slow, wet chuckle. "We ain't here to make trouble. Just want what's ours." Cyrus took a step forward. "Ain't no boy here, just my son." All three paused. Then Jax spat into the snow. "That so?" Cyrus nodded once. "That's so." Cutter's grin thinned. "Mighty bold lie to tell, especially when there's good bounty money on that little rat's scalp. Dead or alive, government don't care much. Paperwork's all the same." From the porch, a creak. Then Hawk stepped out of the shadows, bow in hand, arrow nocked, drawn to the cheek. He didn't say a word. His eyes black and still locked on Cutter's heart. Not a twitch in his stance, just iron and ice. The bounty hunters stilled. All their bluster and boots and noise suddenly seemed too loud, too heavy. Jax's hand drifted toward the butt of his pistol, but Cutter raised a hand. "Easy," he murmured. "Kid's got teeth." Boone laughed again, but it was hollow now. "You got grit, I'll give you that," Cutter said, eyes never leaving Hawk. "But grit ain't bulletproof." Cyrus finally stepped between them, voice like gravel. "You done talking?" Cutter looked him over one more time, then tugged his reins. "We'll be back," he said. "Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but this ain't over." The three turned and rode off, slow and deliberate, like they wanted their words to settle deeper than the snow. Cyrus waited until they were nothing more than specks on the ridge, then turned to Hawk. The boy hadn't moved. "Come on," Cyrus said. "We've got work." They boarded up the barn windows, reinforced the door frames, moved the livestock closer to the house. Cyrus cleaned the Winchester till it gleamed and set out extra cartridges. He filled the cellar with smoked meat and root vegetables, counted every candle, checked the oil in every lantern. That night, the sky turned red behind the mountains, like fire bleeding through a tear in the clouds. War wasn't here yet, but it was coming, and Cyrus Blake intended to meet it standing. The wind died with the sun. It left the valley in a strange, weightless quiet, too still for winter, too heavy for peace. Cyrus sat by the fire with the rifle across his knees, boots planted firm on the floor. Hawk was nearby on his bedroll staring up at the rafters. Neither had said much since the bounty hunters rode off. They didn't need to. Some truths didn't live in words. The fire cracked. Outside, the world held its breath. Then it came. Distant at first, barely there, like the memory of a sound. A slow, low beat. Drums. Cyrus stiffened, fingers curling tighter around the Winchester. Hawk sat bolt upright, eyes wide not in fear, but recognition. He rose without a word, crossed to the door, and opened it just enough to let the night whisper in. The sound deepened, rhythmic, steady. Not war drums, not yet, but not a welcome tune either. It echoed through the trees like a heartbeat rising from the bones of the land itself. "They remember," Hawk whispered. Cyrus stepped to his side. "Who?" But the boy didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the darkness beyond the pines, listening, his breath shallow. The drums didn't grow louder. They didn't have to. The earth itself seemed to carry them. Later, when the fire died low and Hawk drifted into an uneasy sleep, Cyrus lay awake listening to that thrum roll through his walls. He didn't know how long it lasted, hours, maybe, but when he finally drifted off, he dreamed of fire, of hooves, of smoke, winding through endless trees. The next morning, the world was covered in silver light. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, smooth and untouched. The kind of snow that quieted the world and made a man feel like the only soul left breathing. Cyrus rose before the sun crested the ridge, moved through the cabin in silence, set a pot of coffee to boil. He poured it black, steaming, and stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching softly on the frost-laced boards. He lifted the cup to his lips and froze. They were there, lined up across the field, stretching from the edge of the barn to the rise above the creek. Silent, still, warriors. 250 of them. Feathers woven into braids, faces painted in patterns older than the hills, bows slung across backs, rifles at their sides. Each man stood with arms at rest, not drawn but ready, watching. Cyrus stared, heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, he thought he might be dreaming. But the steam curling from his cup and the faint crunch of snow beneath Hawk's footsteps behind him told him otherwise. The boy stepped to his side, barefoot, shoulders straight. His voice was steady. They came. Cyrus didn't ask how. He didn't need to. These men hadn't come for conquest or plunder. They hadn't come for revenge. They'd come for something older. Something deeper. A promise answered. The land remembered, and so did they. The morning air was thin and biting, the kind that turned every breath into smoke and made bones remember old wounds. Cyrus stood at the edge of the porch, coffee forgotten, boots rooted to the boards as if the frost had grown up and grabbed him by the ankles. The field in front of the barn was full of warriors more than he could count, at a glance aligned shoulder to shoulder, unmoving, like a forest carved in flesh and bone. Hawk stood beside him, his small frame drawn tall, silent, his gaze locked on the line of figures as if waiting for something to shift. Then it did. From the center of the formation, one figure stepped forward. An old man. He moved slow, but not weak. Every step deliberate, his presence heavier than his frame. His hair was long, streaked with silver, braided down the back with beads and feathers that told stories Cyrus couldn't begin to understand. His coat was buffalo hide, worn smooth at the shoulders, and his face weathered, lined, creased by time, and law-shelled eyes like chiseled stone. Unblinking, eternal. Hawk saw him and staggered forward like the ground had given way beneath him. "No coma," the boy whispered. Then he ran. It wasn't the careful walk of the hawk. Cyrus knew it was something else, something reckless, childlike. His feet slipped once in the snow, but he didn't stop. He ran straight into the old man's arms. The man didn't embrace him. He placed a hand on Hawk's shoulder, firm, silent. They stood like that for several heartbeats. Hawk's head bowed, his voice a murmur too soft to catch. The old man listened, unmoved. His eyes never left the porch. Never left Cyrus. When Hawk finally stepped back, wiping his sleeve across his face, the old man walked forward alone, stopping just beyond the steps. He stared up at Cyrus without a word, gaze steady as the mountain ridge behind him. Cyrus didn't move. He didn't speak. The man held his stare for a long time, then without sound, without quay, sank to one knee. Cyrus blinked. For a moment he wasn't sure he saw it right. Then, like a wave breaking, every man in the field followed. One by one. Every warrior dropped to a knee, heads bowed, not in submission, but in solemnity. It was the quietest reverence Cyrus had ever known. Hawk stepped beside Nokoma. He lifted his chin, and his voice, when it came, was stronger than it had ever been. "This is my grandfather," he said. "He was taken from the fire. I thought he was gone." Cyrus swallowed, his throat suddenly thick. "And now?" "He came for me," Hawk said. "And for you." Nokoma finally spoke. His voice was low and dry, but it carried like wind through canyon stone. "You sheltered the sun," he said in English. so now the sun will shelter you. Cyrus stared down at him, stunned. Hawk looked up, eyes gleaming. Word had spread. The boy had told the story. And the story had become something more. The valley changed in a matter of days, not with fire, not with blood, but with something quieter, something deeper. The warriors made camp in the wide basin just beyond Cyrus's northern pasture, where the creek split and wound through the low hills. Smoke from their fires curled gently into the sky each morning, rising like prayers whispered straight into the wind. Tanned hides stretched between cedar poles became homes, not outposts. Children ran through the snow barefoot and laughing. Songs drifted across the cold dawn like river mist. Cyrus watched it all with a quiet awe he didn't know how to name. He still got up before sunrise, still boiled his coffee black, still checked the fence lines and counted the heads of cattle like he always had. But now, he wasn't alone. Nokoma came every morning. The old man walked the land like he already knew its stories, kneeling beside the creek to listen to the water, brushing his fingers over fence posts like reading scripture in the wood grain. Hawk translated in soft tones while they worked. "Your land is tired," Nokoma said once, squinting at a dry patch near the southern field. "It remembers hands that took too much, but it will forgive, if given reason." Cyrus had nodded, unsure how to respond, but the words lodged in his chest like seeds. By the end of the week, Nokoma and his people weren't just guests, they were hands. They branded cattle with calm efficiency, moved as one in the corral, taught Cyrus how to dig a new trench off the creek that wouldn't wash out in spring. They patched the roof of the storage shed. They carved tools from things Cyrus would have thrown away. It wasn't charity. It wasn't debt. It was something older, something the land seemed to welcome. One day, Cyrus stood beside Nokoma at the highest rise of the ranch, wind tugging at their coats, the entire valley stretched below like a canvas waiting to be painted. Hawk stood between them, translating with patience. Nokoma said, "Land only lives when its people do, and now, you are part of our people." Cyrus didn't answer right away. He stared down at his home, the barn he built with Evelyn, the fields he thought he'd bury himself in, the fence lines that never seemed to hold now filled with the smoke and songs of a tribe thought scattered. And he felt it, the shift, the truth, in the old man's words. The land was remembering. The town did too in its own way. Riders passed by the road's edge more often now, slowing down, watching. Some tipped their hats and rode on. Others spat into the dirt and muttered curses under their breath. One morning, a preacher rode out and left a Bible on Cyrus's fence post without saying a word. No one dared step onto the property. Not now. Not with 200 warriors lighting fires under the stars. Word spread, further than anyone expected. They whispered about the ranch that had been claimed not by money or law, but by story, by firelight. By the boy with hawk eyes, and the old man who spoke to the ground like it still listened. And in town, they called it strange. They called it madness. But to the land, it was memory. And it was home. The sky turned copper at dusk, heavy with the scent of snow and something sharper, gun oil, smoke, and danger riding in on the wind. Cyrus felt it in his bones before he saw them. He stood by the barn, oiling the hinges on the north gate, when Hawk came running, silent but urgent, eyes flashing like lightning under clouded skies. "They're back," the boy said, voice calm, too calm. Cyrus straightened, wiped his hands on his coat. "How many?" 12, with torches." Cyrus looked down the ridge and saw them. A line of riders, dark shapes against the pale horizon, winding down from the west trail like shadows with spurs. The bounty hunters had come back, not just the 3 from before, but more. Paid hands, hired guns. The kind of men who took gold to forget what their fathers taught them. Cyrus didn't hesitate. He walked to the porch, pulled the Winchester from its hooks, handed Hawk his bow, and they stepped into the yard together. No speeches. No prayers. Just 2 figures, side by side, facing the storm. The bounty men slowed as they reached the fence line. One of Thema, tall man with a scar across his cheek and a silver pistol at his hip, called out. "We know the boys here. This time, you don't get to play father." Cyrus didn't flinch. "This is my land. You want a war, you brought the wrong kind of fire." The man spat. "You think that tribe scares us?" Behind them, a drumbeat rose. Not one. Many. Slow at first, then growing, like a heartbeat carried through the trees. Then the woods came alive. One by one, shadows stepped forward, warriors in full paint, silent as snowfall, faces marked with red and black and white, not yelling, not posturing, just presence, steady, unblinking. Like the bones of the earth had risen to defend themselves. 250 strong. No war cries, no raised weapons, just rows of men, women, and elders standing behind Cyrus and Hawk. The bounty hunters stopped. A few reached for their rifles, then saw what waited beyond the fence. The forest behind them had eyes now, too, movement in every tree line, every brush. They were surrounded before they'd finished their first threat. The tall man shifted in his saddle. Then one dropped his gun. Another followed. Within moments, all 12 rifles were on the ground, barrels kissed by the frost. No blood spilled. No arrows loosed. Just a silence so deep, it crushed the fire out of those men. Cyrus stepped forward, slow and sure, until he stood at the fence. "You ride back to wherever you came from," he said. "You tell them what you saw. This land remembers. This boy is not alone." The scarred man opened his mouth, then thought better of it. He turned his horse. The others followed. In minutes, they were gone, smoke trailing behind them like cowards too scared to admit they'd seen something holy. When the last hoofbeat faded, Hawk looked up at Cyrus. "They won't be back." Cyrus nodded. "No, they won't." Peace had not come from the barrel of a gun, but from the weight of unity, the power of presence, the fire and flood of people remembered. And the land, once again, stood still, not with fear, but with respect. The wind carried the scent of blooming sage and tilled earth as the sun crested over the eastern ridge, casting its golden light across the valley. The barn's red roof glowed like an ember under the morning sky, and the fields shimmered with dew. Children ran barefoot through the rowsome with raven-black braids, others with sun-bleached hair, all laughing, their voices rising like songbirds to greet the dawn. They called it the Ranch of the Rising Sun now. It wasn't a name Cyrus had chosen, but one the people gave it first in whispers, then in stories, then on the tongues of travelers who passed through Montana with dust on their boots and curiosity in their eyes. The name stuck, not because of any sign nailed to a post, but because something in the land had changed, and everyone who came near felt it. Cyrus Blake sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, one leg stretched stiff with age, the other drawn under him. His hair had turned white at the temples, and his beard had thinned, but his eyes were still clear-sharp as ever. He nursed a tin cup of coffee as the morning unfolded, steam curling into the crisp air. The door creaked behind him. Hawk stepped out, now tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm strength in his step that mirrored the man who had once carried him through a blizzard. His braid hung down his back, and his eyes, those same watchful, wolf-like eyes, met Cyrus's with quiet warmth. "Creek's high this morning," Hawk said. "Always is this time of year," Cyrus replied. "Snow melts fast." They didn't say much more. They never had to. Below them, the ranch pulsed with life. Cheyenne and settler children worked side by side, tossing feed, hauling buckets, checking the fence lines. Women chopped vegetables by the outdoor hearth, their laughter echoing off the hills. A young white boy practiced flint knapping beside a Cheyenne elder who corrected him gently, showing how to feel the stone's shape, not just strike it. The land wasn't just shared, it was honored, tended. Understood. Every spring, the warriors came back, not in armor, not in silence, but in peace. They brought drums and stories and food that made the children's mouths water. They built fires not for battle, but for memory. And at night, they sat around the great circle at the center of the ranch, speaking in tongues that danced through the air like wind through pine. Cyrus never stood at the center of those gatherings anymore. His knees wouldn't allow it, but he watched. And listening was enough. Once, a visitor from back east asked why so many tribespeople returned every year. Hawk had answered without looking up from his work. Because once, in a winter storm, a man gave his fire to the sun, and now the sun never forgets. Cyrus chuckled when Hawk told him that story. Sounds a lot prettier than it was, he muttered. Hawk only smiled. It's prettier because it's true. Later that night, under a sky thick with stars, Cyrus lay in his bed listening to the drums in the distance, their rhythm slow and steady, like the heartbeat of the land itself. He closed his eyes and saw Evelyn's smile, felt the heat of that first fire, remembered the moment a boy collapsed at his doorstep and the morning he found him mending a fence. He had thought himself alone back then. But the land had other plans. And now, as the drum beat rolled across the ranch like a sunrise, Cyrus knew peace, knew legacy, knew that sometimes healing didn't come in a flood or a blaze. Sometimes it came in silence, in a bowl of stew, in the eyes of a boy who refused to be broken. The ranch of the rising sun would stand long after his bones turned to dust, not because he built it, but because he opened his door